Inca civilization.
The Inca civilization flourished in ancient Peru between c. 1400 and 1533 CE, and their empire eventually extended across western South America from Quito in the north to Santiago in the south. The Inca is the largest empire ever seen in the Americas and the largest in the world at that time. The Incas conquered people and exploited landscape in such diverse settings as plains, mountains, desert, and tropical jungle. They famed for their unique art and architectures. They constructed finely built and imposing buildings wherever they conquered, and their spectacular adaptation of natural landscape with terracing, highways, and mountain tops. These settlements continues to impress modern visitors such as world-famous sites as Machu Picchu. As with other ancient America's culture, the historical origins of the Incas are difficult to disentangle from the founding myths, and they created for themselves. According to the legend, in the beginning, the creator god is Viracocha. He came out of the Pacific Ocean, and when he arrived at lake named Titicaca, he created the sun and all ethnic groups. These first people were buried by the god, and only later did they emerge from springs and rocks, named sacred Pacarinas. The Incas specifically were brought into existence at Tiwanaku, also known the word Tiahuanaco, from the sun god, so-called Inti. They regarded themselves as the chosen few, the children of the sun, and the Inca rulers was Inti's representative and embodiment on earth. The first Incas came from a sacred cave known as Tamputioko, or the House of Windows, which was located at Pacarig Tambo, and the Inab down from south of Cusco. The first pair of humans were Manco Capac, or the word Manco Capac, and his sister, also his wife, Mama Okyo, or the word Okyo. Three more brothers, sisters, siblings were born, and the group set off together to found their civilization, the Chanca people defeating with the help of stone warriors, or Paruraucas. The first Incas finally settled in the valley of Cusco, and Manco Capac throwing a golden rod into the ground, and he established what would become the Inca capital of Cusco. More concrete archaeological evidence has revealed that the first settlements in the valley of Cusco date to 4500 BCE, when the hunters-gatherer communities occupied the area. However, the Cusco is only became a significant center sometime at the beginning of the late intermediate period at 1000 to 1400 CE. The process of regional unification began from the late 14th century CE and from the early 15th century CE, with the arrival of the first great Inca leader named Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, or reverser of the world. The Chanca defeat in 1438 CE, the Incas began to expand in research of plunder and production resources, first to the south and then all directions. They eventually built an empire which stretched across the Andes, conquering such peoples as the Laupaca, Kulia, Chimor, and Huanca civilization along the way. The rise of Inca Empire was spectacularly quick. First, the all speakers of the Inca language is Quichua, or the word Runasimi, were given privileged status, and this noble class dominated of all the important roles within the empires. Tupa Inca Yupanqui, also known the word Tupa Inca Yupanqui. Pachacuti's successors from 1471 CE is credited with having expanded the empire by a massive of 4,000 km or 2,500 in miles. The Incas themselves called their empire Tawantinsuyo, or the word Tahuantinsuyo, meaning the land of the four quarters or the four parts together. Cusco was considered the navel of the world, and radiating out were highways and secured sighting lines for the world sequence to each quarter, which are Chinsaysuyo or north, Antisuyo or east, Pulyusuyo or south, and Kuntisuyo or west. They spreading across ancient Ecuador, Peru, northern Chile, Bolivia, upland Argentina, and southern Colombia. And also, they stretching 5,500 km or 3,400 miles north to south. 40,000 Incas governed a huge territory with some 10 million subjects speaking over 30 different languages.
Now, let's proceed to the first subtopic of Inca civilization, which are the culture, technology, astronomy, and economy. The first subtopic of Inca civilization is the culture.
Learn how adobe bricks are made. Adobe is an ancient building material made from mud, soil, and water. The mud bricks are then dried out and baked in the sun. The Inca had a knack of art and craft. They were masters at weaving and embroidery. The Inca used textiles as currency and to establish social status. This finely spun wool comes from alpacas and llamas. It takes months to create this beautiful woven textile by hand.
And now, let's talk about the second subtopic of Inca civilization, which is the technology. The Inca Empire was a complex society with an estimated population of 10 million people. They had a large stone cities, beautiful temple, an advanced government, a detailed tax system, and an intricate road system. However, the Inca didn't have a lot of basic technologies were often considered important to advanced societies. Also, they didn't use the wheel for transport. They didn't have a writing system for records, and they didn't even have iron for making tools. These are some of the important scientific innovation and technologies used by the Inca Empire, which are the roads and communication, quipus, stone buildings, farming, calendar and astronomy, and last is the government and taxes. First, let's talk about the road and communication. The Incas built a large system of roads that went throughout their empire. The roads were usually paved with stone. The stone steps were often built into steppe area in the mountains. They also built bridges where the roads needed to cross rivers. The main purpose of the roads was for communication, moving army troops, and to transport goods. The commoners were not allowed to travel on the roads. Communication was accomplished by the runners on the roads. The fast young men called the word chaskis, and they would run from one relay station to the next. At each station, they would pass the message to the next runner. The messages were either passed verbally or by using a kipo. The messages travel quickly, this way at the rate of around 250 miles per day. The second scientific innovation and technologies used by the Inca Empire was a quipus. A quipu was a series of strings with knots. The number of the knots and the size of the knots and the distance between knots is conveyed meaning to the Inca, sort of like writing. Quipus only specially trained officials to knew how to use it. The third scientific innovation and technologies used by the Inca Empire is stone buildings. The Inca were able to create sturdy stone buildings without the use of iron tools. They were able to shape large stones and have them fit together without the use of mortar. By fitting the stones closely as well as other architectural techniques, the Inca were able to create large stone buildings that survive for hundreds of years despite the many earthquakes that occur in Peru. The fourth scientific innovation and technologies used by the Inca Empire was the farming. The Inca were expert farmers. They used irrigation and water storage technique to grow crops in all sorts of terrain from the desert to the high mountains. Despite not having beasts of burdens or iron tools, the Inca farmers were very efficient. The fifth scientific innovation and technologies used by the Inca Empire was the calendar and astronomy. The Inca used their calendar to mark religious festivals as well as the seasons so they could plant their crops the correct time of the year. They studied the sun and the stars to calculate their calendars. The Inca calendar was made up of 12 months. Each month had 3 weeks of 10 days each. When the calendar and the sun got off track, the Inca would add a day or two to bring them back into alignment. And now, let's talk about the last scientific innovation and technologies used by the Inca Empire, which is the government and taxes. The Inca had a complex system of government and taxes. Numerous officials kept watch over the people and made sure that the taxes were paid. The people were required to work hard, but their basic needs were provided. The Inca science and technology had interesting facts. First, the messengers who ran on the roads were punished harshly if the messages was not accurately delivered, and this is rarely happened. The second is, the Inca built a variety of bridges, including suspension bridges and pontoon bridges. The third is, one of the main forms of medicines used by the Inca was the coca leaf. The fourth is, the Inca developed aqueducts to bring fresh water into town. The last is the basic unit of distance used by the Inca was 1 piece or the word tatki. And now, let's moving on to the third subtopic of Inca civilization, which is the astronomy. Astronomy was one of the most important studies for the Inca civilization. And of course, they developed it very well. They were able to define constellations, stars, the passage of time, the change of season, and etc. The Inca city of Machu Picchu is completely built according to the sun. The same happens with the old buildings of the city of Cusco, whose streets were designed to imitate the constellation on them. This is already astounding, but recently it was just discovered that the Incas had more knowledge than was believed. The city of Machu Picchu and other ancient Inca cities like Pisac or Ollantaytambo are geodesically aligned. This feature can be found in some other places considered sacred. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the Mayan cities, the Pyramid of Egypt, and many other places considered sacred to their own civilizations, and they have their own alignments. The Inca civilization and the stars. In order to establish cities in the middle of the Indian mountain range, the Incas needed great knowledge about the climate, seasonal changes, and how they influence agriculture. This great knowledge allowed them to grow and accelerate pace, reaching to encompass the territory through 6 current nations, which is from the northern Chile and Argentina, through Peru and Bolivia to Ecuador and Colombia. In less than 300 years, the Incas went from being a small family caste to being the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. The Inca religion was based on astronomy. This religion was complicated and closely tied to the astronomy. The Incas worshipped various gods, including Viracocha, or the creator, Inti, or the sun god, Kilia, or the moon. But they will also consider god stars, mountains, rivers, and some other impressive natural creations. The importance of astronomy for the Incas. Astronomy was very important to the Inca civilization because of its use in agriculture. Astronomy was used by the Incas to identify solstices, seasonal changes, and to identify the best time of sowing and harvesting. But it is not all. The urban distribution of ancient Cusco imitate the constellation in the sky. Like the ancient Egyptians, the Inca culture was based on the horizon. They built carefully placed pillars and carved mountains and hills near the Cusco. This allowed them to identify the passage of time with great accuracy according to the height of a specific shadow. The Inca constellation, which are the light and darkness. In looking at the star, the Incas realized many constellations which resemble what they saw in their daily lives, animals and things. They believed that Viracocha had given every animal, bird, and every living things a corresponding star that protected it. Grouping the stars into constellation became a very important practice for the Inca civilization. The Incas identified constellation in 2 types. The first is formed by the cluster of stars to be connected. These create images of animals, gods, heroes, and more. These constellations were considered as inanimate. They believed that the cluster of stars known as Pleiades directly influence the welfare of animals. The second type of constellation consists of the dark spot of the Milky Way. These dark spots were considered animate constellations of living animals, and the Milky Way was considered an innermost astral river that was crossed by the spirit that finished its route in the earth. The Incas are one of the few ancient civilizations that were able to identify constellations without the presence of the stars. These are some of the constellations of animals identified by the Incas: the serpent, the toad, the partridge, the yame, and the fox. Now, let's proceed to the last subtopic of Inca civilization, which is the economy. During the Inca Empire's comparatively brief reign from 1438 to 1533, Inca civilization established impressive economic structures that allowed for substantial agriculture production as well as cross-community exchange of product. Though The Inca society had some of the most successful, centrally organized economies in history. Its effectiveness was achieved through the successful control of labor and the regulation of tribute resources. In the Inca society, collective labor was the cornerstone for economic productivity and the achieving of common prosperity. The people in Ilo are the heart of economic productivity in Inca Empire. They work together to produce that prosperity. This prosperity caused the Spanish to be amazed about what they saw when they first reached to Inca in 1528. According to each ILO, labor was divided by region, with agriculture centralized in the most productive area, but also ceramic production, road construction, textile production, and other skills were part of the ILOs. After local needs were satisfied, the government gathered all surplus that is gathered from ILOs and allocated it where it was needed. People in the Inca Empire received free clothes, food, healthcare, and schooling in exchange for their labor.